In the late 19th century, Japan emerged from centuries of isolation. Once a quiet island nation under the Tokugawa shogunate, it began to transform rapidly after the Meiji Restoration in 1868. The emperor's government opened the country to trade, embraced Western technology, and modernized its army and navy. Within just a few decades, Japan went from samurai swords to steel warships. This transformation ignited an ambition that would shape the destiny of the entire Pacific. Japan looked across the seas toward Asia and saw opportunity, power, and empire. By the early 20th century, Japan had already proven its strength on the battlefield. In 1895, it defeated China in the First Sino-Japanese War, gaining control of Taiwan and influence over Korea. Only 10 years later, it shocked the world again by defeating Russia, one of the great European empires, in the Russo-Japanese War of 1905. For the first time in modern history, an Asian power had defeated a Western one. The victory inspired national pride and a deep belief in Japan's divine destiny. Newspapers celebrated the empire's rise as the dawn of a new era for Asia. Many saw Japan as the natural leader of the East, the guardian meant to liberate Asia from Western colonial powers. But others saw a dangerous ideology growing beneath the surface, the idea that Japan's superiority gave it the right to rule others. Through the 1910s and 1920s, Japan industrialized rapidly. Tokyo and Osaka became modern metropolises. The economy expanded, and Japanese companies became major global players in shipping, textiles, and steel. Western culture flooded into the cities: cars, jazz, and cinema. Yet traditional values and the worship of the emperor remained at the core of Japanese identity. Modernization and nationalism grew side by side, feeding one another.
But prosperity was fragile. The Great Depression of 1929 hit Japan hard. Exports collapsed, unemployment rose, and many rural families faced starvation. In this crisis, people lost faith in politicians and democracy. Instead, they turned to the military, the one institution that promised strength, unity, and renewal. By the early 1930s, military leaders gained enormous influence over the government. Generals and admirals filled key political positions. They preached the idea of Hakko Ichiu, the 8 corners of the world under one roof, Japan's divine mission to bring Asia under its protection and guidance. In reality, it was a justification for conquest. In 1931, Japan made its first move toward empire. Using a staged explosion on a railway line as a pretext, the imperial army invaded Manchuria, a region rich in coal, iron, and farmland in northeastern China. The invasion was swift and brutal. Within months, Japan established a puppet state called Manchukuo, ruled by the last king-emperor, Puyi, as a symbolic figurehead. The world was outraged. The League of Nations condemned Japan's aggression, but no real action followed. Western powers were too focused on their own economic troubles to intervene. For Japan, the message was clear: the world would not stop them. Inside Japan, the military success in Manchuria sparked euphoria. Newspapers praised the army as heroes. Schoolchildren learned that Japan was destined to expand and free Asia from Western domination. Dissenting voices, journalists, professors, or politicians who spoke against militarism were silenced through intimidation, arrests, or assassination. By the mid-1930s, the Japanese Empire had become a power obsessed with destiny. The military controlled the government, the emperor was seen as divine, and the people believed Japan's mission was to bring order to Asia by force if necessary. In 1937, that destiny collided with the vastness of China. The Marco Polo Bridge incident, a minor clash between Japanese and Chinese troops near Beijing, became the spark for full-scale war. What began as gunfire in the dark turned into an inferno that would consume millions. Japanese divisions swept through northern China with terrifying speed. Cities like Beijing, Tianjin, and Shanghai fell one after another. But with every victory came a darker shadow, a brutality that stunned even the hardened soldiers who carried it out. Shanghai burned for months. The world watched in horror as the city's skyline vanished under fire and smoke. Civilians fled in millions, seeking refuge wherever the rising sun flag had not yet reached. And then came Nanjing. In December 1937, the Imperial Japanese Army entered the Chinese capital. For 6 weeks, chaos reigned. Tens of thousands were executed. Women were assaulted. The river that once gave life to the city ran red. This was not just war. It was annihilation. News of the Nanjing massacre spread slowly across the world. Western journalists smuggled out photographs and letters, while diplomats begged their governments to intervene. But in Europe, attention was turning toward another growing storm: Hitler's ambitions in the West. China fought on, refusing to surrender. General Chiang Kai-shek relocated his government deep inland to the rugged mountains of Chongqing. From there, he vowed that China would never bow. Japanese bombers soon followed. Night after night, Chongqing burned. Families dug shelters into the rock. Children grew up beneath the echo of sirens and collapsing stone. By 1939, Japan controlled most of China's eastern coast, yet still the war dragged on. For every mile gained, Japanese soldiers paid in blood and exhaustion. For every village captured, another uprising began behind them. In the jungles of southern China, guerrilla units formed, small, determined, and invisible. They called themselves the Invisible Army. Men and women, peasants and former soldiers, all united by a single truth: they would rather die standing than live under occupation. Japanese officers began to realize this was no ordinary war. They had expected a campaign of months, not a quagmire of years. And deep within Tokyo's war rooms, a dangerous idea began to grow. If Japan could not crush China quickly, perhaps it was time to cut off her lifelines. Oil, steel, rubber, all flowed from the western colonies of Southeast Asia, from the British, the Dutch, and the Americans. The generals began to look south, their eyes fixed on the Philippines, Malaya, and the Dutch East Indies. To conquer China, Japan would need to control the Pacific. The empire had awakened, but it was hungry. And hunger, history would soon learn, can drive nations to madness. By 1940, Japan stood at a crossroads, victorious in China, yet bleeding from within. The war had devoured resources faster than the empire could replace them. Factories roared day and night, but without oil, without steel, without rubber, Japan's might would soon crumble into dust. And so the generals looked beyond the battlefield, toward the southern seas. There lay the colonies of the old European empires, lands rich in the very materials Japan needed to survive. Malaya, with its endless plantations of rubber, the Dutch East Indies, overflowing with oil, and the Philippines, a chain of islands under American control, a dagger pointing at Japan's heart. In Tokyo, meetings were held behind closed doors. Admirals, army chiefs, and imperial ministers sat beneath portraits of the emperor as maps of the Pacific stretched before them. Every island, every port, every shipping route was marked and measured. To take the South meant war, not only with Britain and the Dutch, but with the United States. Still, the choice seemed inevitable. Japan's leaders called it the Southern Expansion Doctrine. They believed destiny demanded it. In the same year, Japan signed the Tripartite Pact with Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy. Together, they formed an alliance that promised to divide the world between them, East and West, Axis and Allies. The message was clear. If America opposed Japan, it would face war on multiple fronts. Across the Pacific, the United States was watching. President Franklin D. Roosevelt understood what this meant. He strengthened the U.S. Navy, imposed trade restrictions, and moved the Pacific Fleet to a small island base called Pearl Harbor. To the Japanese High Command, it looked like a threat, a provocation. But to Washington, it was a warning. Meanwhile, in the occupied territories of China, Japanese soldiers continued their ruthless campaign. Entire towns were razed to the ground. Resistance fighters were executed publicly. Every victory brought new hatred, new defiance. The empire was expanding, but it was also isolating itself. The United States finally struck back, not with bullets, but with sanctions. In 1941, Japan was cut off from 90% of its oil imports. Tankers stopped sailing, factories slowed, warships stood idle, their fuel tanks running dry. The Japanese cabinet faced a stark choice: withdraw from China or find new sources of oil. To retreat was unthinkable. To wait was suicide. That left only one path. The plan was audacious and terrifying. Strike south, seize the Dutch and British colonies, and destroy the American fleet before it could respond. If the U.S. Pacific Fleet could be crippled, Japan would rule the seas. Their empire would stretch from Manchuria to Indonesia, a fortress built on blood and ambition. Behind the closed doors of the Imperial Navy, one man began to design the impossible. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, brilliant, disciplined, and deeply conflicted. He had studied in America, admired its people, and understood its power. Yet he also knew that if war came, Japan must strike first, and strike with total precision. He looked at the map of the Pacific, tracing the route of Japanese aircraft carriers toward the Hawaiian Islands. In silence, he whispered words that would echo through history. "If I must fight, I shall run wild for 6 months. After that, I have no expectation of success." It was a prophecy, and the countdown had already begun. In the shipyards of Kure and Yokosuka, engineers worked day and night. They built aircraft carriers, bombers, torpedoes, each one a piece of a massive secret puzzle. Thousands of men trained in secrecy on remote islands, learning how to attack ships that were anchored unaware. By autumn of 1941, the plan was complete. A single devastating blow. One morning, one strike to cripple an empire before it could awaken. The world still believed peace was possible. Diplomats met in Washington, exchanging polite letters and promises. But across the Pacific, Japan's fleet was already on the move. The stage was set. The sky above the Pacific was calm, and soon the world would burn.